0, -1, -2, and we're live.
Hey everybody, how are you all doing?
Hello.
Yep, sorry for
Hello.
sorry for being late. Just a few technical difficulties on my end, but yeah, we're good to go. And yeah, we're here joined by. You want to introduce yourselves?
I am Colton Maxwell Anderson of the Hopian.org. We did some live streams back last year, and said I promised to debate Filthy and Esso, so here I am. Sadly, everyone else on the site is too busy right now, so I dragged in Wes to help me.
And I'm Wes Savage. They've called me Shrimp Po Boy time to time. And I'm here to partner up with Colton.
Yeah, hearing you read out your name is just one of the most amazingly fitting things ever. Just reading it's not the same.
What's that?
Thanks.
Just your accent, it makes it very clear with your accent that it's supposed to be read in that accent.
Oh, thanks. It goes back to the cultural the faux boy, and it also goes back to a reference to a comedian by the name of Ron White.
Oh yeah.
Not familiar with him.
And you all know who I am. So I don't need to introduce myself. But God, yeah. I wish it was like that on every stream. But yeah, so for the last couple months or so, both Heretic and I have been talking about wanting to have a debate over our essay that we put out over the last summer, more specifically the subject of that essay. And it's taken a while to finally organize this, but we have, and it appears there's going to be multiple parts, so that's, I hope it was worth the wait. But yeah, for those who don't know, last summer, Heretic and I finished up an essay that we'd been writing for, I'd say we had been talking about it since September, but we didn't actually start writing it until December of 2019.
Yes, that's about right.
It's a formal critique of the philosopher Hans Hermann Hoppe, which Heretic and I, needless to say, are somewhat controversially pretty critical of. Although a lot of variants of a lot of our arguments can be found through people like Bob Murphy or Roderick Long. So it's, for the most part, we weren't treading on new territory. But yeah, considering that Hoppe does have a following in the libertarian communities, and we're being very critical of the Hoppian methodology, naturally, this is going to spark a debate. So, here we are, Heretic. Do you have anything to say about it? Or better yet, to any of the guests, did you have anything to say about it?
Not really. As I'm one of the editors and the second guy in the Hoppian.org, yeah, I probably a decent person to have on. Yeah, so I'm more of a strict Hoppian, while Wes has other ideological leanings other than Hoppe. So
I'm technically a Hoppian panarchist because the state is absolutely impossible. The only way you can have a minimal government is if it's a panarchy, and that's an inciting of the retired professor of finance and fellow of Mises Institute by the name of Michael S. Rosef, an author and political economist and author and botanist by the name of Paul-Émile Depute. A Frenchman corrected my original false pronunciation mess up. Thank you, Frenchie, for that. And so he calls himself. And Aubrun Herbert. But I also have a few Konkinian leanings in certain areas. And I have Konkinian leanings. But I'm a Hoppian panarchist.
We can go over that later if you'd like, although my impression was that this was just going to be about argumentation ethics, although...
Yes, sir. That's what it should.
Although since
Right.
since Heretic and our disagreements are going to intersect with a lot of the other subjects, I'd imagine it's going to be very difficult not to bring them up. I'm just sort of preparing in advance, though. I'm not being hypocritical. It's just at some points that's probably going to happen.
Yeah,
But,
we're gonna want to keep each other aware of what the topic of the debate is. Obviously, there's going to be some drift. There's going to be some discussion about topics tangentially related, but I do want to keep this about argumentation ethics. I know we talked about next week doing a follow-up debate on covenant communities, and if you want to do additional debates, we haven't discussed that yet, but we could definitely have that option.
Right. It's just my schedule. I'm kind of making way in my schedule to do these debates. It's so I just wanted the two main topics, and then so just to keep my word on that we will have debates, and then it's just I am
sweet.
just swamped essentially.
Understandable. Yeah. So don't know if we really have anything else to go over, except there is one thing I want to say real quick, just to our audience. Don't give anyone any hate. Don't do anything.
Yeah.
Don't attack. Don't mass dislike anyone's videos. None of that stuff like that. Don't leave mean comments. Please, for the love of God, do not do that. Okay, we're trying to have a friendly discussion here.
It's a pure civil discussion and a debate to convey our points across, to see if we can have any mutual agreement and whatnot, or at least to convince some of you who may be watching one way or another and whatnot, to have our voices heard. That's what it's supposed to be for. This ain't don't spurg out and be pricks, because if any of my fucking subscribers do it, I'm gonna block them from my channel. It's that simple, and I'm gonna probably cuss you in DMs before I block you, because I will do that, and I'm not apologetic when I do it, because I've done it before to some people who've done shit like that.
Yeah, there's just no reason to be nasty. I mean, even if you're not concerned about how you look or how others are going to take it, it's just not good for you spiritually either. So
yeah, well, the problem with it more than anything is that if you actually have a problem with the position that somebody else is arguing, criticizing them is one thing, that is making sort of informative statements about what was wrong with what they're putting forward. But if you want them to actually change their views, the last thing you want to do is hound them, because that's just going to not only make them double down, but it's going to make them feel like they've invested a cost into their demonstrably incorrect position, and it'll make it more difficult for them to change their minds.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I cannot agree more.
But anyway, so I have some opening statements here. They could have been longer, but I'd started writing them like an hour before we started the stream. And I don't know. If you have any opening statements, you could start if you'd like.
I think the way we should do this is, since you're making the pro position on why argumentation ethics is a proper framework for understanding libertarian ethics, that you should start, and then Esso will read his statement in the con. Sound okay?
That's what I was thinking.
Okay. I was going to do kind of the we already discussed that. I guess that could work. Although I'm not prepared to do that really.
Yeah, Esso, you can probably do it first, and that should give Colton some time to collect his thoughts.
Okay, well, the reason that I asked if you wanted to go first is because I wrote this basically with the idea in mind that Colton had already read his off, but I can still. So I wanted to make it clear from the beginning that our intention on challenging both Heretic and I, our intention on challenging the base of many other self-proclaimed libertarians' frameworks in the positions they argue from, is in no way an attack on them or necessarily an attempt to establish that they can't be libertarians, as there's been an attempt, mostly furthered by unscrupulous actors, but nonetheless an attempt to characterize our criticisms as a denouncement of certain people. From my perspective, criticism is an internal check for consistency within a philosophical movement. Criticism adds necessary context for where potential shortcomings in an argument's coherence may be present, and allows for people to correct for said issues and to establish an epistemic basis for what their principles are, which is necessary in the first place for said principles to inform other people about what a philosophy's claims are putting forward, what they're making. A philosophical movement, in short, which can't be criticized, doesn't deserve any respect from an intellectual standpoint, as we can neither discern what claims are being made, since we can never be sure what basis the philosophy's principles are being informed around, and we can never test it against competing theories, thus making it useless. I believe libertarianism's claims about the nature of society, political authority, free will, organization theory, action, etc., to all be valid. I consider myself a libertarian as a result. If this wasn't the case, I had found another set of principles to satisfy my skepticism as a libertarian towards concepts I'm skeptical of, as well as demonstrate what's necessarily wrong with them, I would stop identifying with libertarianism tomorrow. And it's because I believe this that I'm fond of criticizing other libertarians for the shortcomings I see in their arguments, or correcting people who are very blatantly arguing against entailments of libertarianism while identifying with libertarian philosophy. That being said, and I've hinted at this several times so far, something which both our opponents may find to be amazing, and maybe a few in our audience, is that Hoppian principles don't run into conflict with ours in any way, or in fact any libertarian for that matter, or any philosophy for that matter. This is because most philosophies on just about every single subject, regardless of how conflicting their conclusions are making the same statements of reality on any given subject. So how can so many vastly varying conclusions be drawn then? Why are there so many different philosophies? Well, this is because every single debate in philosophy, there is actually a point of contention, but it's not a disagreement over which principles are valid, but what entails them. Because what entails a principle, so its methodological basis, its epistemic basis, what model of logic it's centered around, etc. What entails a principle within one's methodology informs whether or not the said principle is even consistent or even logically coherent for that matter, along with whether or not it's an informative observation. That being whether or not it can actually explain the nature of the subject it claims to, along with how and why a theory is able to do this. So what's actually in dispute between left Rothbardians or agorists like Heretic and I, Hoppians, or just about any other movement in libertarianism is what counts as a just standard of property. Why? How? What counts as property? Why is self-ownership a valid concept? What do these things inform us? How do they interact with us? What is the logical method of analysis for understanding these concepts? I have an hour-long video explaining this nuance in greater detail on the main channel. What is Alliance of the Libertarian Left? But agorists or left Rothbardians start from what informs our epistemology and see conclusions as not being coherent unless they have an epistemology which can demonstrate these conclusions to be true. As a starting phase. This is what Konkin referred to as means and ends consistency throughout his works. In other words, agorists and left Rothbardians promote Aristotelian logic. Because of this, our conclusions about what counts as a valid standard of property are radically different from the Hoppians, who inform their arguments using the inductive method, but we don't disagree that Rothbardian property standards are valid. We can get into that later into the debate, as I'm sure we'll need to, and that's where I finished writing.
Okay, so
All right.
as an introduction into Hoppe's argumentation ethics, there's basically three basic propositions that Hoppe makes that I'll expand upon as I write them, as I say them. So the first proposition is justification is propositional justification. That is, not only do you need to make propositions in order to justify a stance, but you also need to put forward these propositions in some form of media or medium. So you either need to speak them, you need to write them. Let's say for some reason, or you can have them, let's say on a screen. So it's not really technically writing; it's more like typing. But there is some method by which you are conveying this information. And in doing so, you take on certain presuppositions. For instance, if you're writing a book, you have to own the book in terms of the physical materials that make up the book. If you're speaking, you need to own your body. And as you're writing the book, you also need to own your body in order to type it on a typewriter or write it down with a pen or something like that.
Or with a pencil and coordinate yourself to do so, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. So you need to be able to physically own your body in order to make arguments. Since the person is arguing, they have to accept self-ownership. Yes, as Max says, the closest thing to a neat syllogism of argumentation ethics is in the PFS speech. What is it? Why libertarianism is practical libertarianism. It's about the first 5 minutes. So the second proposition is argumentation presupposes property in one's body and the homesteading principle. I already talked about ownership in one's body, but the homesteading principle is all about since you own your body. Sorry, I went forward a little bit too much. Since there is scarcity in the world, I cannot do Y with a certain object, and while you do X with a certain object. We need to figure out who is going to do what with the object. Am I going to do what I want, or are you going to do with what you want? And so we need to create a norm, or there needs to be a norm for how this gets done. And this norm needs to reduce the amounts of conflict, as the whole purpose of norms is to get rid of conflict. And so you cannot have a norm that creates more conflict than any other state of affairs. So the homesteading principle comes in because when a resource is unowned, that's never been used before, and I start using it, my use of it is the first time it's been owned, because ownership is the physical control of a resource. So if I start picking fruit out of a tree, and no one has ever picked fruit out of this tree before, I become the owner of that tree. And obviously no one planted the tree and so forth. But so there's this entirely unknown resource. I start using it. I'm not aggressing. I'm not interfering with anyone else's use of the tree as they're not using it. But if a second person comes along and starts using the tree, they're interfering with my use of the tree. And so the norm is that I get essentially first dibs. Since I homesteaded the tree, I own it. So, and you can see with the second, third, fourth person, they're going to have a conflict if they try to use a resource that I am trying to use. Because as we begun this, if I want to do X with a certain thing and you want to do Y with a certain thing, we must inevitably come into conflict because the object is scarce and we cannot use it for different purposes at the same time. And so that is why the homesteading principle comes out of argumentation ethics. And so there's homesteading and the homesteading principle. Since all of this has been backed up by the proposition of argumentation, then no deviation from this ethic of self-ownership and homesteading can be argumentatively justified. But because then you'll fall into a self-contradiction by arguing for something that is counter to the very presuppositions by which you're arguing for it. Wes, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I would have said it, but Techno said it in the comment section for me. He was to condense it down. You can't argue against self-ownership in good faith, as you are then hypocritical by doing so, because when you argue, you are inciting self-ownership and you are conducting purposeful action. Henceforth, you are conducting what you're conceding to and inciting praxeology. And to argue against self-ownership is praxeologically a praxeological performative contradiction.
What about competing standards of property? What about competing claims about property? Because the thing is that there isn't actually such a thing as an anti-property position. There are just positions about which attempts to make competing claims about the nature of property.
So, as Mises points out in Socialism, you cannot divorce the title of private property from the power of disposal or the ability to do with what you wish with the property. If you assert that you cannot do a certain thing with this property, you are exerting ownership over the property.
Yeah, and where I think you're getting confused is I'm not suggesting that competing standards of ownership can exist at the same time. I'm saying that it's not really. You're making a categorical error in that you're assuming that ethics and claims that people express are necessarily the same subject. And
could you repeat that?
You're making a categorical error by assuming that ethics and claims that people make are the same subject of study. Like how people act is the same as ethics. And ethics is a study which informs us about what is justified in how people interact with one another. This is kind of one of the major issues that I have with ethical concepts being justified by presupposition, is that if they are just if we're going to skip over method of analysis that we're looking at property with, the framework we're contextualizing property in, if we're going to look over what that's founded upon, and to say that something justifies property it's a meaningless declaration, because
Well-
it doesn't tell you what it's justifying. It just says, well, this thing is justified.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out was that everyone has a presupposition. In other words, everyone has a worldview by which they view the world. And so just trying to everyone
Of
has
course,
everyone
but
has
people
to
aren't
just,
inherently logical.
Well,
Sorry.
let him finish.
Yeah, I apologize.
so everyone has so it might be true that someone is not acting logically in the present, but you cannot appeal to this when you're making ethical claims that no one really acts logically, so we can just ignore logic in terms of justifying our presuppositions and our ethics. Your ethics needs to be logical in order to actually justify it, because otherwise you're not really making an argument, because an argument is based on propositions, and propositions are a part of logic.
First of all, you're talking about how people act once again. Talking about how people internalize information and how they attempt to act on resources around them or themselves. That's a different category once again. But Heretic, did you have anything to say?
Not particularly at the moment. Right now, I'm still
Okay,
I'm still just processing information. So, yeah. Also, just
So the
wondering,
different-
Well,
can I interrupt?
but-
Can I interrupt real quick? I'm sorry if I'm throwing off anyone's train of thought, but I just
Okay.
realized that I didn't mention that there is a not zero chance that we might get donations, and so don't be alarmed if I suddenly interrupt and say that we have a donation, because the audience won't be able to hear you, because text to speech will probably be talking over you. So just a heads up that probably could happen.
Okay. That
In
is
terms-
fine.
Thanks
I'm
for
not
the warning.
I'm not suggesting that because there isn't any because we can't make ethical standards, because ethical standards aren't a sort of prescriptive norm, that we should just shrug our shoulders and ignore acts of aggression. What I'm suggesting is that this is an inaccurate way of looking at ethics as a study. Heretic, did you have anything to add on the subject?
Basically, the idea. Sorry.
It feels like you. I'm sorry. It feels like you haven't said much. So I want to.
I mean, I really have not said much. It's true, but you're kind of on a roll. So, anyways, I was just going to add that ethics, in a nutshell, is a social study. It's an observation based on the methodology of methodological dualism, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. Mises's what's that freaking book called? Theory and History.
Action? All
Oh
right.
yeah, I was thinking Theory and History, probably because I read that one most recently. But yeah,
I was-
Human Action as
I was-
well. But
I was thinking of Human Action because that's where he explains praxeology.
yeah, but the basic idea is that since we're all praxeologues, we all completely understand that we can't operate on understanding human behavior on the basis that it's going to operate on the same framework as, say, planets revolving around the sun. or any other kind of natural science. What it needs to be understood is that the motivations and incentives that underlie human behavior and why it is that people act the way that they do. With this understanding, the inductive method is a very poor way of being able to understand human behavior and human action. And this is the problem that I see fundamentally with the framework of trying to understand human behavior from a normative and prescriptive standpoint. You end up just creating hypotheses on how people behave, and you end up with a very top-down framework of trying to understand human behavior.
Okay,
So-
but
Sorry.
this seems like you're just disagreeing with how Mises defines praxeology.
That's what it sounds
I-
like.
Neither of us are disagreeing with how Mises argues for praxeology. We're just are you familiar with the principle of concordance?
Well, the reason why I
Or-
say that is because you're disagreeing that you can use deduction as sort of a prescriptive
I said
thing as
Inductive.
how
I said induction.
induction as a proper way of describing how people act. So that also kind of how should I put this? But also it's as Hoppe even describes it, argumentation ethics is a purely deductive framework.
It's a purely deductive. It's a purely deductive metaethical analysis and logical proof argumentation. That's what it is.
Yeah, so a deduction moves from an idea to an observation, while induction moves from observation to an idea. And in argumentation ethics, he never moves away from the well, he does move away from the idea, but he starts with an idea of norms and what defines self-ownership and what and so on and so forth. He doesn't start with an observation of, hey, this is how the world works. He's not arguing from the nature of things. He's arguing from what is called, a priori analytic statement.
That's what libertarianism is claiming, though, in the context of social studies. Is it's making a normative claim about the nature of authority, essentially, of political power. But back to the statement about praxeology. I'm not disagreeing with the logical foundation that Mises had laid out. What I'm suggesting, though, and why I mentioned the principle of concordance, is that if we're going to treat if we're going to understand why economics has to be argued from the perspective of the social sciences, the same standard there's essentially the same standard of criteria present when we look at the study of ethics. Ethics are attempting to study how people act, why they do, but is not making necessarily prescriptive statement about them. So what I'm arguing in the context of ethics is that if you're going to argue praxeology in the study of econ, your philosophy has to be making consistent claims about comparable studies. Otherwise, there's an internal inconsistency, and that's the case when we look at how mentioned that argumentation ethics is purely deductive. Well, that's not necessarily true, because Hoppe references a lot of concepts like property, for example, and doesn't necessarily even though he attempts to just explain what property is, he doesn't justify or he doesn't even attempt to justify necessarily what the correct way to argue from property is. he doesn't at property as a concept, not the conclusion that he's attempting to draw from argumentation ethics.
Well, I mean, he does so in other areas, and when you're reading argumentation ethics, it's kind of I would say kind of assume that you already kind of know what property is, but I could go and get you one of his definitions of private property from A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism.
That's my point, though, is that property is not really a concept that you can just sort of define and say, I have a coherent theory of property now. You have to start from essentially the question of agency. Do people have agency? Yes or no? If not, can't logically justify property, because if you do, then the concept of property is justified. And you work up there.
Okay, so I mean, he does talk about what property is made of. It's a scarce resource. That means that we can't do two separate things with the resource. He also talks about how humans aren't in universal harmony, that people will come into conflict on what they want to do with certain resources. And he talks about what is being decided here is who gets to do what with private property, with the scarce resource. And so the definition of private property is kind of implied there, but if you already understand what private property is, the concept at least, you'll just grasp it. But if you don't, it's implied there, and if you well, it might take you a while to get.
What if I don't, and what if I have a competing understanding of property? Like you are aware, for instance, that the 19th century libertarians defended the concept of property. Proudhon, for instance, defended the concept of exclusive ownership. His arguments weren't some like cringy woke take against like rent, for example. Against the concept of rent. He wasn't making some like cringy woke-lit argument. He was actually arguing against them as a just concept within property. Rent contracts, I meant. I said them. So what if one of them Proudhonian mutualist were to read Hoppe's argumentation ethics?
As I described, it's already implied because he's talking about private property, and then he's saying it's a scarce resource, and we're deciding who gets to do what with it. And here's the definition of how you determine that.
There's also the competing claims of homesteading, insofar as you have the Rothbardian homesteading principle and the Lockean homesteading principle. Now, you could argue that Rothbard is a successor to the Lockean principle, but it's not inconceivable that someone who maybe dislikes Rothbard on personal reasons is going to see Hoppe defending the homesteading principle and just interpret that to mean the Lockean homesteading principle is what's being defended. And ultimately, Hoppe doesn't really provide any clear framework, at least not that I'm aware of, that allows people and allows readers to be able to determine which interpretation of the homesteading principle is more or less valid than the other.
So, from page 343, moreover, if a person did not acquire the right of exclusive control over such goods by homesteading action, i.e. by establishing an objective link between a particular person and a particular scarce resource before anybody else had done so, but if latecomers were assumed to have ownership claims to goods, then no one would be allowed to do anything with anything, as long as one would have to have all of the latecomers' consent prior to ever doing what one wanted to do. He does go talk about homesteading, but he does also talk about what homesteading is. It's using a previously unused resource, an unused and unowned resource.
Yeah, but he's not okay. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. So do you think that property as a concept can be justified? if one simply says that their basis for justifying the concept of property is justified.
Well, no, I mean, that's not what argumentation ethics is. It's actually an argument of why the presuppositions of argument has implicit within it self-ownership and private property.
You can make presuppositional statements, but the problem with presupposition is not that the conclusion is necessarily wrong. It's that conclusion can't be demonstrated by the argument, because there's no clear standard of what informs the principles the conclusion are based on. So you could be arguing a correct conclusion, but you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that using the presuppositional argument. And in fact, in order to know that it's a correct argument, you would need some other framework.
So are you saying that you can't examine presuppositions?
By nature, you can't examine presuppositions because presuppositions assume their conclusion to be valid in their premise.
Not necessarily. You don't have to.
It's not possible to create to establish a coherent standard of what counts as a principle or why this is the case and how. Than a presupposition. Presuppositions are things like property is justified because self-ownership.
Well,
yeah, but so if someone asked you to justify, well, so if someone asked you to justify self-ownership, you would just say, I can't talk about presuppositions?
No, I would argue, if we were in an actual debate, I would simply point to the existence of moral agency.
Okay,
which entails the concept of which is entailed by free will and naturally leads to the concept of self-ownership.
So, but what I'm getting at is, you're just moving back a step essentially every time that you do this. Is there anything that you could go to, Will, if you don't support this, you're going to end up either in a self-contradiction or you're going to end up essentially refuting yourself? Or do you have a positive proof of
you can make a contradictory statement. You can make a statement which runs into conflict with one of the previous previous entailments in its sort of its logical chain, if you want to call it that. In the case of Hoppianism, for example, Hoppe makes prescriptive claims about ethics informing people's actions while also claiming to be a praxeologue.
Well, there's no
prescription in his argumentation ethics. None.
There's no.
To clarify, I'm not talking about prescription in the sense that this is how people act. I'm talking about prescription in the sense of assuming that there exist norms and behavior standards outside of how individual people act in a praxeological sense.
Well, to say that this is how people act would be a descriptive claim, technically. That would not be prescriptive. What you were suggesting is that would be descriptive, not prescriptive.
And Hoppe doesn't even...
No. I'm not. You mischaracterized, or maybe I should probably use a different term. You maybe misunderstood what I was arguing. I'm not suggesting that he, or at least I'm not arguing that he was, that he's describing other people's acts, as in he's putting forward a standard of what counts, and then arguing that you could only describe the things within his framework, and is attempting to create a standard of what counts to describe things. That's not what I was arguing. What I was arguing is that he establishes this standard, sort of this standard of what counts, and then he attempts to like model social interactions around that. You can even hear it in the description of argumentation ethics that you provided. Well, people would be likely to, or people would need to create these property standards to.
Well, in order to find out who can do what with a certain resource, you do need to create a stand. You need to have some system in place that will be able to determine that in ethics.
And that's a fundamental disagreement Heretic and I have with this position.
Would that not
so you're arguing from nihilism?
No, of course not.
That's what that would be. And that would be a relativistic statement, or nihilistic.
No, it's not. Again, I mentioned earlier that we view ethics as a social science.
So okay,
we don't view ethical claims as making prescriptive statements, but we're both natural law theorists.
So can I take a minute to answer a slight criticism of mine in the chat?
Oh, sure, by all means.
Okay.
So Max says AE is a transcendental argument, not some arbitrary presupposition. AE proves every possible denial of Rothbardian ethics is a self-refuting argument, like saying language is meaningless. So what I mean by presupposition is not just some arbitrary thing. If you have a transcendental argument, you're going to start off with some presupposition. However, the beauty of a transcendental argument is that it proves the presupposition.
Is to analyze and finally to see if it's provable. The presupposition is evident. That's the point.
And since presuppositions are not informative, that I guess I would disagree with that framework. But, fuck, I lost my train of thought. What were we just about to get into?
Well,
natural law. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
We were being accused of. I guess accused maybe being too strong a term, but basically, Colton was wondering if we were arguing from the framework of nihilism.
No. I guess a Teilhard version of Aristotelian Rothbardian principles would be that without barriers to entry created by state institutions, everybody has an equal claim over themselves or their property, and thus you have a more ethical society, or a society that's closer to being ethical. He expressed this view, by the way, in a book called Power in the Market, which I would recommend everybody watching read, because it's basically it's like a proto Konkinite work, for lack of a better way of putting it.
So you're talking about Rothbard's book, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I was making sure because I missed the author's name. So,
we disagree that there, in order for there to be law or a standard by which people could defend their property, that there needs to be some sort of arbiter. In fact, arbitration as a firm creates problems in the context of property theory, but we can get to that later if you'd like.
I want to also go back to a very since you guys are going back and forth. I wanted to make a moment to interject on when you initially said. When you initially said you made the claim that the one cannot have anti-property positions, only how we deal with property. That's not true.
Only making
anarcho-communism is an epitome of an anti-property position, because they advocate against property as a whole.
I'm sorry.
Or anarcho-syndicalism, and some flavors of anarcho-syndicalism would be against property. They claim to follow Proudhon's framework, but
I'm not sure that's reasonable, because any of the so-called anti-property positions actually do make very clear claims as to what to be done with property, because they'll claim that in the case of anarcho-syndicalism that property ought to be allocated, or rather will be allocated, in the sense that they don't make prescriptive claims among the syndicates that make use of that property, make use of the means of
and it's
production,
also-
and with the anarcho-communists and other forms of collectivists, they either make the claim that it ought to be owned by everyone in society as equal shareholders, or that it ought to be controlled by the state. Now, whether or not you agree with that or not is besides the point. The only observation is that they're not making anti-property claims. They may be making anti-private property claims, but they're certainly still understanding. They're still operating on the understanding that scarce resources do need to be allocated in some way. They just have a way of doing so that is, well, in contention with yours.
It would also depend on the anarcho-communist or anarcho-syndicalist you're talking about. Heretics referring to people that a lot of the modern ones claim to follow, like Kropotkin or Rudolf Rocker. But if you actually read their material independent of like the Marxist wokelets that attempt to recontextualize it within a Marxist framework, what they're actually arguing is not actually that radically different from what Rothbard was arguing or what any other libertarian is arguing on ethics.
I'm not. How should I put this? Wes, do you have anything?
Well, not at the moment.
'Cause
But
I'm
I'm gonna fundamentally disagree with this. But
I mean, I also fundamentally disagree. It's just hard to figure out where I want to start. So
I mean,
do
I'm sorry.
do you understand that a mutualist understanding of property, or a syndicalist understanding of property, and a Hoppian understanding of property would lead these people, if they were in the same society, into conflict?
yeah, I would imagine so.
I'm asking Esso and Filthy.
Right. Fair enough.
Potentially.
Well, I mean, the entire purpose of a property system is to determine who gets to do what with a certain resource. And so, if a syndicalist thinks that everyone should get, let's say, a vote on how a factory is run, but the anarcho-capitalist owner is like, no, I get to determine what I do with my own property. Do you not see how that's going to come into conflict with each other?
Yeah, and this is just question begging, both in that it assumes we have the same ethical view of property, which, considering Heretic and I disagree with you guys on what counts as a study of ethics, that's going out the window from the start. But also, I think that it would also be weird from an economic standpoint to characterize any sort of society as being dominated by a single model of organization. And this isn't just a problem with Hoppe. This is something that most types of anarchists do. And that's getting it almost into a different subject, but the fact of the matter is, I don't see why there's no reason necessarily why different models of firm can't just operate at the same time as one another within a single economy.
So, if it's question begging, where in my question did I assume the premise?
Because you assume that we agree that an ethical society or a Rothbardian society has like a prescriptive legal system enforcing standards for how people should organize their firms.
Well, that's not how I formulated it. I asked if a syndicalist thinks that a factory should be run, by a vote of the workers, and the anarcho-capitalist owner doesn't think so, how is that even going to, do you not see how that's going to resolve into conflict unless we have a understanding of who owns what?
I mean, it might, but we know that the ANCAP factory owner is justified, so he's right in defending his property.
There's gonna be conflict no matter what. There's just a question of who is in the position to defend themselves, defend their rights.
I'm not entirely convinced that a hierarchical management model can exist without a state because of how much the state plays a role in externalizing maintenance costs for them. That's another subject, I guess.
Yeah, that's an entirely different subject, probably for another time.
Just wanted to say that because of the example that was provided.
Well, I'm only saying that because the syndicalist wants private property. Well, wants property to be owned communally, and the anarcho-capitalist owner of the factory wants it to be private property and to be his private property. Since the factory cannot be both owned communally and owned by only one guy, there's going to be a struggle against how the factory is operated.
Yeah, and people can just create different firms if they don't like an unstable model that can't calculate information very well.
Well, yeah, I guess the syndicalist could do that, but who's going to tell either the syndicalist or the anarcho-capitalist to move on? I mean,
why is this our problem?
Yeah, exactly. We're not the ones making prescriptive claims.
No, I'm trying to get a grasp on what you're arguing for. So so you're saying that one of them is going to move away, but neither one is going to want to move away. The other one, each one's going to say, "You move away. You're not." The syndicalist is saying, "You're not actually the owner. It's owned communally," and the capitalist is going to say, "I am the owner, and this is not owned communally." How are you going to resolve these competing property claims?
Listen, Colton, we take the position of rational humility that we're not central planners. We're not trying to prescribe how people, or we're not arbiters either. We're not trying to prescribe how these disputes ought to be resolved. They're going to be resolved among the actors involved, and they're going to know better the context of the situation and the conflict better than we are. So I'm just saying, sorry, but I'm just saying, like, if you want to understand our position, I would strongly advise that you figure out a different analogy, because I don't think you're going to get much useful information from this.
Okay, so going with Filthy's, how do you think property comes into being?
Property is an entailment of self-ownership, and we've explained self-ownership previously.
Are you talking about property as a subgroup of ethical study, or are you talking about property as in actual claims that people are making?
So let me be more precise. How does property rights come into being?
How does property rights exist? Are they brought into existence? Is the question. Simple as that.
And you're not being very clear still whether or not you're talking about property as an ethical concept or as an actual resource that's been claimed. I can explain either one if you'd like.
Why should they be distinct?
Well, it's a distinction between property as a liberty right and property as a claim right. Liberty right just meaning that I have a right to be able to own something. That doesn't necessarily mean I own it. Like, let me just go with a completely wild example. Please indulge me here. I have a claim right to a ICBM with a nuclear warhead. I don't have a ICBM with a nuclear warhead, but I have a liberty right to acquire one. However, that's distinct from a claim right to an actual ICBM with a nuclear warhead.
That's just one of the incoherent things that arises when we're thinking of claims and property in ethics as being the same thing. But what makes them necessarily separate from one another is the fact that ethical study is making claims about how people interact. So we can't really create models in a prescriptive sense to describe this. Hence, they're two different things. Well, they're not. Okay, let me rephrase that. They're not different things. It's just that morality and how people are acting informs us as to whether or not society is being ethically consistent. But ethics are justified as a concept. Are justified because individual people are moral agents, and moral agency is justified by the concept of free will. So, just as for how does one defend their property, or what defines a property claim? Property is simply violence. It's whether or not you are occupying a property or using a property. If someone is acting upon you to try and hinder that, you can use violence to stop them. And ethics tells us what claims within what claims of property are valid.
All right, let me ask a couple questions. How would you what do you define as claim right and liberty right?
A claim right is claiming to be entitled to a resource or service, and a liberty right is a claim to act in a certain way.
So when I'm asking how a property right comes into being, I am not only asking about the claim right, how does the actual claim right come into being, but since you need a liberty right in order to generate a claim right, based on your description, you would also need to justify the liberty right.
I just explained both, but getting back to argumentation ethics, we can go back to anything else you guys had to say.
So you made some claims that ethics, in other words, the moral principles that govern a person's behavior, can.
We don't accept that definition. We don't accept that definition of ethics.
So what do you mean by ethics then?
I thought you were going to talk, Eric.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to talk. Sorry.
Well, I don't know. We explained this a few times. Since we know that moral agency is informed by free will, that informs the concept of self-ownership, because we're always acting upon ourselves at any given moment, and it would be logically inconsistent for another moral agent to ever have a rightful claim to act upon us. So I guess that necessitates the concept of ethics. What necessitates the concept of property is just people operating acting upon rivalrous scarce resources with one another. That justifies the concept of property and ethics. As for claims, I just mentioned a moment ago that claims are just violence, but property as a concept tells us which ones are justified and which ones aren't. And in a society where everyone has the same claim over themselves and their resources, we can naturally have an ethical society.
Do you not see that by justifying self-ownership, you are actually creating a moral principle that says self-ownership is right and any deviation from that is wrong?
Well, I don't think that the latter claim necessarily follows, because it's not entirely clear what the latter claim is saying by arguing that deviations are wrong. Yes, I'm establishing an objective claim of truth. don't see exactly how that follows into making prescriptive claims about morality and how others act, though.
So, what I mean by any deviation from that, meaning what I mean is anything that is not self-ownership, anything that contradicts self-ownership as a framework. For instance, slavery, I think, is something you used previously in an.
Yeah. I'm not
Slavery,
disagreeing.
collectivism.
I argue that self-ownership is a valid concept, but I don't think that the Hoppian framework suffices to explain it.
So, I understand that, but what I'm trying to get at is, well, we started disagreeing about what even ethics is. So
Well,
do you not see that if you're saying that one thing is correct and one thing is wrong, and you're talking about how people are, the framework on which society is based, which is self-ownership, that you're creating a moral principle on which we can judge, let's say, that slavery is an immoral action.
Well, we're not making any moral claims. Like, in a nutshell, moral claims are just preferences for how other people ought to behave, and ethics doesn't make any claims at all about how people ought to behave. In a nutshell, ethics are a social study that observes how actions are conclusions that themselves require justification.
Ethics are a moral theory or moral philosophy study.
Well, they're more philosophy put into action.
That's it.
It's just defining what your claim is about the subject in explaining what it is. You're just defining your conclusion as being a part of it.
Except I'm not. I'm just defining what ethics as a study is. That's all I'm doing. That's not a prescription of any type.
No, I'm not suggesting that it is. What we're arguing about, though, is whether or not ethics can inform your morality. And in trying to explain to us what ethics is, you defined it as being as being a study which makes claims about morality. That's question begging, my dude.
It's not question begging.
It is, because
no, it isn't.
You have to define morality.
All I did was describe what the study was. That's all I did.
No, now you have to define morality.
I did. It's determining what is right and what is wrong, and ethics is putting what's right and wrong into action in terms of how people's behavior is governed, or the conduct of an activity is governed.
It explains to us what's right and wrong. We know ethics is a justified concept, but we also know that human behavior, it doesn't conceptually make sense to try to model how people process information or how they will act. So ethics has to be a social science.
Well, the thing of it is that it doesn't matter that people act immorally or break ethical codes. That doesn't destroy ethics.
We're not disagreeing.
We're not saying it does. We're just.
In fact, it would only make sense to argue that if we were putting forward the notion that ethical claims are prescriptive, which is precisely what we're arguing against.
Right, and I would even agree with that, and Hopper certainly would, that it's because he's an anarcho-capitalist. He believes that ethics proves anarcho-capitalism through argumentation ethics, and he does not see no states in the world. So no one's defending that because such and such is true, that is how the world works.
I'm not sure what you were trying to argue there.
Well, you keep on talking about how you're not defending prescription, and so I'm not understanding why we are even getting, why you keep bringing that up.
Why we keep bringing it up is because through the attempting to model, you're trying to model how humans are going to behave through morality, and we're trying to argue that if you treat ethics as a social study and you recognize that it's simply making observations about how certain actions require justification, that you're going to have something that more accurately describes reality that can be more accurately characterized as knowledge.
It's relevant because, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that's essentially not just our core disagreement, but everyone's core disagreement on every subject is what counts, why it's justified, etc.
I mean, not everyone agrees with the same principles, but some people do disagree with the justification of the same principles. You'll have fascists and socialists that don't even agree with private property, but as a principle, but
they have views on property, though.
Well, they but
they agree that property is a concept.
Right, but they don't have the same principles of what
would entail as property and how and what would be justified to use as property, etc., etc.
Right. When we're talking about entailments, that's where everybody disagrees. In terms of just arguing about concepts, almost everyone has more or less the same general statements about them, just disagreeing over what justifies them or what counts as what justifies as a thing within that study.
Okay, so I wanted to circle back to something, and I haven't had a good segue into it. So it seems like you are disagreeing with being able to use a synthetic a priori in order to create a conclusion, essentially. You don't think that you can start from a priori statement and create a transcendental argument from it.
I think that you can put forward a conclusion, but it's not informative, so it's not actually an argument. You could put forward praxeology as a conclusion, but if there's, in your argument, there's nothing telling me what it is, what it explains, then it's meaningless.
So praxeology is a method, not a conclusion. It is the study of.
Yeah, but I'm talking about within debate over methodologies. Praxeology would be a conclusion that one comes to within that subject, I guess.
So
I was talking about conclusions earlier. I was speaking generally as like in a broader philosophical context.
Right, but you seem to have a problem with Hoppe's use of a transcendental argument, so I was going to ask you, where do you think knowledge comes from?
It's a bit of a broad question. It depends on the subject that we're talking about, and there are a whole lot of different subjects. Not all of them are justified the same way, as we've gone over. Not all of them, there are conceptual reasons. You have to create different criteria for analyzing different subjects talking about the same topic.
Right, but how would you even know where to start categorizing them?
And that's another issue, I would think, because ethics deals with ought and social sciences deal with is. That's another issue I have with a lot of these.
As soon as you step outside of a prescriptive framework, there isn't a problem there. In fact, David Hume himself wrote an essay explaining that it doesn't apply it doesn't apply to ethical philosophies necessarily. Hume's
guillotine does. It's a philosophical razor. So yes, it does.
It's specifically about skeptics saying that. Specifically attacking the natural rights tradition, that you can't get from an is to an ought, and therefore the natural rights.
He was arguing specifically against people like Samuel Ballgay or John Locke. He was talking about people who were making prescriptive claims about ethics. He said as much. I'll link the essay in here after the stream because I can't for the life of me remember what it's called. But there was somebody on YouTube who did a pretty good video about it. Or usually, is one of those philosophy channels. Like, I'm blanking on his name too, Gary something. I'm sorry, but yeah, that's I think that's one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, with how people discuss the NAP is just not really understanding that ethics being prescriptive is not it's not a given. In fact, there are a lot of problems you run into when you think of ethics, ethical principles in that way.
Yeah, I just never seen anyone talk about ethics in a prescriptive way.
Like Rothbard talking about how, there needs to be at least later Rothbard, I should say, talking about how a libertarian society needs a legal code to define property.
So by late Rothbard, what do you mean? Because that is even in Ethics of Liberty.
Yeah, I meant post 1975.
Yeah, Ethics of Liberty was what? Early 1970s?
Yeah, I mean, it started in the 1970s, but when I refer to early Rothbard, I'm talking about 1969 and prior to that. Because and the reason why I make the distinction is because Rothbard makes he contextualizes property differently, as in what his standard of property is. Or like he considers himself by the end of his career to be a theorist in the Lockean tradition, whereas in the 1960s, Order Without Power is an essay that he wrote, I think is worth reading. He was just as critical of Locke as well as he was any other so-called anti-property theorist.
Well, I mean, even in Ethics of Liberty, and any neo-Lockean would criticize Locke for the proviso. Neo-Lockean private property ethic is also called the non-proviso Lockean ethic. So it's a modification of the Lockean ethic that's trying to keep the very core of the Lockean argument, but getting rid of a lot of the
proviso or whatever.
Yeah, my point though was more, and Rothbard's criticism, by the way, was over what counts as labor mixing. But yeah, later on in his career, he changes a lot of his views inexplicably about a lot of different subjects and like what entail principles in those subjects. It gets from the point where in his earlier work, he was openly arguing that it's ethically justified for factory workers to kick out their management bureaucracy in the legal market because the legal market framework is defended by state cartels. He did so in an essay called Confiscation and the Homestead Principle. But yeah, by the end of his career, he's arguing that things like encirclement are valid land claims. So, I mean, that's something that I think you guys have to take into consideration, because you treat him as though he has consistent views throughout his career. The early 1970s were that was more of an evolutionary phase of Rothbard's work, where he just got involved in the party and
James
was mostly just trying to support the party by that point.
So Order Without Power was written by Norman Balagian, however you say that last name.
Balagian?
Yeah. So, but
there's an essay called Order Without Power written by Murray Rothbard. I'll link it in the group chat. So, I mean, there might be another person who wrote an essay with the same title, but okay, dead noise.
Dead air.
Yeah, no, I'm just...
That's fine. I'm just getting it the PDF myself as well.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to have to disagree with you wholesale on that, as Max did, that Rothbard's views didn't change much. So the and actually Jared would be a better person to talk about that.
I mean, they clearly
But-
did, because we can see that his earlier essays, specifically the confiscation of the homesteading principle essay, he is incredibly critical of government privilege and using government power to privilege certain groups, whereas later Rothbard, particularly late 80s, early 90s Rothbard, was overtly recommending using government violence to achieve certain objectives, especially
Unleash
political
the police.
objectives. Unleash the cops.
Well, I mean, do you disagree that criminals should be punished?
Nobody should be
Don't
punished.
disagree. Just don't think that the state is legitimate and thus doesn't have a claim to do so.
And I have problems with punitive systems of justice entirely, but that's an entirely separate conversation. But yeah,
Okay,
I mean, for
so,
sure, the
but do
state
you
is
think-
the absolute worst way to, well, do anything.
So let me more clarify what I mean. Do you believe that people who break the law, break private property ethics, so on and so forth, should there be some penalty or recompensation for having done so?
So
that's really-
are we talking about a society without a state, or are we talking about what's considered private property now, legally considered private land, but they're not compatible with Rothbardian homesteading or contract theory, and are in fact defended entirely by state violence?
You also have the problem of what counts as a valid property claim, because you could end up with a Soviet Union transitioning into the Russian Federation situation, where the Russian Federation just gives a whole bunch of their resources to their friends, and they end up becoming the Russian oligarchs that we all know and love today. Because fundamentally, there's really been no change in terms of
Right.
the state's ability to control and distribute resources to their friends.
So what I'm actually, so I understand that, but my question was, if a person breaks the private property ethic, let's say by stealing something that someone rightfully owns, do you think they should compensate the victim of that or face some type of penalty?
That's something that the two parties need to work out among themselves.
I don't see how that has anything to do either way with punitive justice, because I
didn't mean it by punitive justice. I just meant punished as paying some penalty or compensating or something like that. I didn't.
That's literally what I said.
Oh, the context
do you actually think that if someone broke the private property code, should they actually pay some kind of penalty or some kind of compensation for breaking that
Okay, why?
code by stealing?
So why I presumed that we were talking about this in the context of punitive justice is because that's how this current tangent we're on started. We were talking about whether or not Heretic brought up the "unleash the police" quote, and what Colton had asked me was just was a response to that. But that being said, no, neither Heretic or I are arguing that it's unjustified for people to be able to defend themselves or their property.
So the next question I would have is, if I disbar you from defending yourself, don't you think that I should defend you and your property for you?
Disbar me from defend. So you're talking about the state, or
Yeah.
are we talking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Rothbard's argument.
Well,
The
no,
state
I
has-
disagree. Yeah, I disagree wholeheartedly. And yeah, this is Nations by Consent Rothbard that we're talking about, and I disagree wholeheartedly with the idea that actually, I think that would summarize most of my disagreements with Hopkins, that if an organization is using coercion to limit your options so that the organization in question is the only one that can provide that resource or service to you, that doesn't mean that that is a just exchange. That just means that that organization is coercing everybody involved. It's a coercive institution. It coerces everyone.
I'm not disagreeing with what you just said, but what I'm disagreeing on is I think if someone is, let's say I disable you somehow, I break your kneecap and you can't walk and you need to walk for your job, and so you can't do your job. I think that I would be on the hook for paying for any damages that causes from you not being able to walk. And same with the state. The state is disbarring you from defending yourself, and as the only person that they are allowing to defend you is themselves, they need to defend you.
Yeah, I don't know why you're boxing me into this dichotomy, because I mean, you keep laying it out. The state is coercing us, so we don't have any options. And because we don't have any options, both for arbitration or security, other than the state, it means that people aren't actually going to be able to defend themselves or have disputes, because the state is always going to have a superior claim. That's an example of that's an example of a coercive actor from an Aristotelian perspective. So what do we do? What do we do about those things? Well, the state's not going to defend our rights because, well, as I just noted, it always has a superior claim over you. If it leaves you alone, that's irrelevant. The fact is, it could come take your property at any time, as long as its monopolies exist, and there'd be nothing you can do about it.
So the whole argument about unleash the cops is not about.
What I was getting into is, we agree this thing is bad, but I'm not gonna try and rationalize it and to say, well, it's gonna defend these arbitrary property standards, whether or not they're arbitrary. So let's defend it. No, I want to subvert that institution so that we can have an ethical society, so that everybody can defend themselves on an equal playing field.
So I'm not saying that it's justified or it's okay as long as they defend property. What I'm saying is since they have disbarred me from self-defense, they have an obligation to provide me with that defense. And so
question.
Me, they should do what I say. If they won't let me do it myself, they better do it the fuck I say, or I make them. That's really the entire.
So
you can still defend yourself.
Not legally. Not legally in many
cases. Who cares about legally? You can still defend yourself.
Yeah, so, and the state legally can say that even the U.S. government doesn't even claim this, but even if it did, I mean, it can say that it legally has an obligation to protect you. That's both impossible if we just look at the praxeological analysis. Scarce resources have to be employed at any given moment for different interests. That's both impossible praxeologically, and it's impossible ethically, because when you have an arbiter with a greater claim over everybody, they're necessarily going to be at the mercy at any given moment of that organization.
Now there is one thing I actually wanted to ask, because I think this is getting into something important. What makes you think the state has the ability to stop you from being able to defend yourself?
So in the moment, it might not, but as we have seen with the BLM riots, if you defend yourself and your property from the riots, they will come back with a bunch of hired guns in order to take you away.
Cockroaches?
I can't quite hear you, but
I said cockroaches. He said cockroaches.
Yes.
Sure. I'm talking about cops, but they can be SWAT, they can be National Guard, whatever you want.
Roachy boys, glowers.
Yeah, that's what
Yes,
was saying.
Max, I understand that, but I'm talking about ideally, if you can't contract out a property protector, and someone's preventing you from doing that, they should become your property protector.
But they aren't.
No, they
All they're doing,
no,
all
they
they're
should
doing
fuck-
is all they're doing is victimizing me. I still have
Well,
the
they
ability to
shouldn't-
defend myself.
Shouldn't or ought not do anything other than fuck off.
Well, that would be ideal, but as long as the state exists, the state is not going to fuck off.
The state,
That's what I'm saying.
the state ought to fuck off.
But yes, so this is actually what I've been trying to get at. It's not that you've been interrupting me; it's just that there was always something else I wanted to talk about. So this is not an ideal situation. This is just dealing with the situation as it is and what should happen in the interim between where we are now and a stateless society.
But we're not making prescriptive statements about how people ought to behave, remember?
All I'm saying is that people still have the right to defend themselves. All that's really changed is that you have a coercive monopoly that's victimizing people for defending their rights. But the point is that they can defend their rights. They can still do so despite no matter to what extent this coercive monopoly attempts to aggress against people for doing so. All that's really identified is yet another example of the millions of other examples we could probably think of off the top of our heads of ways the state victimizes people. And so, as SO said, and I've echoed previously, all the state is obligated to do is go away forever.
So, first off, the obligation there is an art, just so you know. And furthermore, if I lock you up in a cage, yes, I should not do that. However, if I do that, I am obligated to give you certain amenities like food, water, in order to keep you alive and to keep you
to serve your prison sentence, or as arbitrarily deemed or whatever.
Well, I'm talking about kidnapping. It would because if I were to kidnap you and not do those things, I would count that as murder and not merely kidnapping.
That would be murder through negligence and starvation. Yes.
Prisons do that all the time to people, and there's not really anything that can be done about it because the state, runs the prisons and has a monopoly on both arbitration and security.
But my private jailhouses, according to Kolensky.
Call prisons and local jails in the U.S. private. It's like calling the federal. It's like calling the federal.
We know. I was memeing.
Yeah,
on
I
this
know.
Stupid ass.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I was just saying it's like calling the Federal Reserve private. It kind of just
It's retarded.
It gets to the point I was making earlier, where unless we're starting from epistemology to say to talk about private property is meaningless, you have to have an idea of what informs that.
Okay, so Macintosh put up a quote, and this is kind of what I'm trying to get at. As Hoppe said, some may object on the grounds that they are state police. On the same grounds, do you also object to the police arresting murderers and rapists?
Yes.
I object to them existing. That's the point that we're trying to make here.
So, yeah,
I'm not
I
saying
object. What I object to is that they've usurped for themselves the ability. They usurped for themselves the ability for people to defend themselves, and made it illegal for the victims to be able to defend themselves as well as seek recompense for the acts of aggression that were committed upon them. They don't have the right to exist.
But
this, in my perspective, is the most insane part of like the paleo circle of libertarian thought. Not just you guys specifically, but the notion that the state limiting who can provide security and arbitration in society to itself, coercive means that you have to rationalize and justify the state exercising this ability. It's the equivalent of asking me to defend somebody, asking me to defend somebody who's basically beaten everybody over the head and has the ability to do it again, and nothing would ever stop them.
Okay, but so you do object to the police arresting murderers and rapists, then?
Yes.
If
I
they
said it already.
If they objected them
Yeah, okay.
existing,
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
It's
they're
not to
saying
say-
yes,
and then
on the
we can
grounds
drop-
they don't want them to
Not to
exist.
say that's
Sorry,
not
go
to
ahead.
say that that's not to say that nothing should be done. It's actually on the contrary. I would argue that there are several things libertarians can do even right now as a way to try to destabilize that infrastructure that allows the state to have a monopoly on security. That's what libertarians should be doing, should be trying to provide subversive and more productive alternatives. But yeah, just because I don't think that the state should be going around enslaving murderers and rapists, that doesn't mean that Heretic or I are arguing that murder and rape is an okay thing to do.
Yeah,
You can be against- you can-
wasn't-
Yeah, you can be against both murder and rape and also be against the state enslaving people who murder and rape.
So,
Yeah. Hi.
So it's been a fairly long stream for me. I have to get up in the morning, so this is kind of where I'm going to get off. I don't know what Wes wants to do.
I have to get up. I have to go get up and take care of some other stuff too tomorrow.
All right, so we're gonna be wrapping
All
things
right.
up here. Do you want to do closing statements real quick?
Closing statements. So it seems like the main issue here is not so much argumentation ethics in themselves, but the very basis, the epistemology of how people are able to get knowledge. That argumentation ethics is a transcendental argument that seeks to justify a truth claim using a purely deductive method, and that the argument against it is essentially
A performative contradiction, I believe.
argument. Yeah, that's more about what argumentation is, not the debate. The main disagreement is about if you can create transcendental arguments in the first place, and can those transcendental arguments apply to the social sciences. And since I'm not a logical positivist and instead a praxeologist, I would have to affirm that transcendental arguments can apply to the social sciences. So, do you have anything? So I'll hand that off to you because you started and then you can finish.
All right, I'll do the closing statements. So unfortunately, there were a few points that I was not able to get to, but
Likewise.
And same with me. Same with me.
yeah, stuff relating to how argumentation ethics does not differentiate between whether or not it justifies a claim right or a liberty right. How, because of how unclear argumentation or ethics justifies self-ownership, there's no differentiation between whether or not it justifies self-ownership on the basis of individuals or simply the self-ownership of the two people who are communicating, what part of the self is owned, or even questions about what property claims are justified. You could easily come up with an example of property claims, including that of other people, that would not create a performative contradiction if articulated through argumentation, as pointed out in previous essays, as well as the extent to which the universalization principle also completely torpedoes the framework for argumentation ethics to exist. But with this in mind, what we were able to get to, I think, is incredibly valuable and very insightful, the extent to which that argumentation ethics underlies a prescriptive framework of ethics that attempts to model human behavior and attempts to prescribe onto people how they ought to behave, and as well as the extent to which ethics and morals are conflated to be one and the same. And I think this information has been, well, particularly valuable. I don't know, Esso, do you have anything to add to that?
Well,
Not necessarily.
I disagree with your consider what was it again, the prescribing element. I would disagree with that because, again, there's no prescription in argumentation ethics and its structure as is. There was none of any kind, of any form.
Seems as though
I never got to several areas. There's several areas you guys had, and there's several areas I never managed to get to.
It seems like you were it seems like you were confusing prescription in the ontological and epistemological sense.
Not really, but we never got to fully go into that either. But
yeah, I wanted to explore, at least in my opinion, more what exactly are some of the problems with presupposition. I mean, so we covered that for the most part, and because that was, the subject we covered the most, I was intending on going on a lot longer. But yeah, since that's the main area of contention between everyone in libertarian circles, and that's mostly been what I've expressed skepticism of towards Hoppians, that's, I think, no matter what, going to be what any debate on the subject is going to center around.
Yeah, so I think that's about it for me. Wes, you can go ahead and keep on talking if you like, but I have to get going. It's as I said,
I gotta head off too because I got a couple of things to edit.
Understandable. Well, we do thank you for stopping by, and we're going to be doing this again next week.
At this point, yes.
All right. Yeah, let us know if anything changes, because we do want to do this again next week. Yeah, thank you again for stopping by. We'll see you next week.
Yep. See ya. Bye.
No problem. Take care, guys.
Yeah, see ya.
Tomorrow I gotta go call and check up on somebody, a friend of mine.
Are they okay?
Dying of brain cancer.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Oh, freaking! It's always freaking cancer.
Yeah. Shit. Take care, everyone.
Right.
See you, man.
See ya. Jesus, it's always freaking cancer, isn't it?
It is. That was a sudden mood killer to drop on me.
That's a bit of a mood whiplash. I mean, for some reason though, my mind's going to CAR T cell therapy. Have you heard of that?
Maybe. What was that though?
Basically,
cell therapy.
Basically, they biopsy a part of the cancer tumor. They grow it in a culture. I don't know if it's actually called a culture, but basically they grow it. And then they start introducing retroviruses to it that are specifically tailored to... No. What they do is they also take a part of your immune system, like a part of some of your immune cells, and they introduce viruses to it to make your white blood cells and other immune cells grow protein receptors such that they can recognize the tumor as an invader. Because, well, people get cancer all the time. But the reason...
I've heard of that. I didn't know that was what it was called, though.
Yeah, so, at least from the trials that I've heard, it's been overwhelmingly successful. I don't know if Wes is actually going to hear this or not. I don't even know if he's going to even be able to act upon this knowledge, but I don't know. That's just my mind went to.
Are we still streaming?
Yes, we are.
Oh shit! I was about to. I was about to say something I shouldn't have.
Oh god, yeah, that would have been pretty edgy. So, anyways,
It didn't
yeah.
have to do with race, but still, I shouldn't have said it.
Someone asked in the chat, what are these trials called? I didn't say they were what the trials were called, but I know that's called CAR T cell therapy. So you can look it up on that basis. CAR-T, and T refers to, of course, the T cells. I think the CAR is the protein marker specifically. I know there's another one where they cut out some of the parts and they introduce the viruses directly into the body. But I find it particularly interesting because they've kind of created a vaccine against cancer. But anyways, yeah, we should probably wrap up the stream.
All right. See you guys next time. Yeah, next week we're gonna be debating too. I do genuinely hope it was worth the wait because I've been talking about this for a while.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that it happened. I think that it's gone well so far.
Yeah, I think I should probably speak up more next time. But I kind of had a few. I kind of had a few topics that I wanted to get into personally, and it never really got there. So that's why I was mostly silent.
All right.
And I think Wes actually felt the same way. So yeah, I think what should happen is I should probably make a more concerted effort to steer the topic towards the things that I kind of prepared for.
All right.
But anyways, yeah.
Thank you guys for watching.